What happens when a girl makes a desperate hand signal on a plane and no one listens? The sun was setting as the massive commercial plane taxied onto the runway. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, flipping through magazines, adjusting air vents, or staring blankly at their phones. Among them, a man sat in first class, observing everything. He was dressed simply, dark jeans, a plain button-up shirt, and a leather jacket. Nothing about him stood out, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. Because while everyone else on this flight saw him as just another passenger, he was actually a billionaire in disguise. Ethan Cole had built an empire, a self-made billionaire. He owned companies across multiple industries. Private jets were his norm. But today, he had chosen to fly commercial. Not because he had to, because he wanted to see the world as it truly was. Away from the polished walls of luxury. Away from the filtered words of assistants and advisors. Today, he was just Ethan, the observer. And that was when he noticed her. A few rows ahead, a young girl sat by the window. She was no older than 10, with dark brown hair and loose braids. Her small hands gripped the armrests tightly, and her eyes darted around as if she was waiting for something or someone. Beside her sat a woman, cold, distant, stiff. She didn't look like a mother. There was no warmth, no reassuring touch, no casual conversation. And then Ethan saw it. The girl's hand moved subtly. Her fingers curled into a small, deliberate signal. Once, twice, a motion almost too quick to notice. And yet, something about it made the hairs on Ethan's arms rise. Because he had seen that gesture before, but not in ordinary situations. He turned slightly, glancing at the flight attendants. The lead stewardess, a woman in her late 40s, was busy in the galley, organizing refreshments. The younger one, fresh-faced and enthusiastic, was attending to a wealthy couple demanding extra pillows. Nobody else seemed to notice the girl, or the way her hand kept making that strange signal. Ethan leaned back in his seat, trying to recall where he had seen it before. A business deal? A negotiation? No. Then it hit him. It was a distress signal, a universal sign of silent danger. And yet, the flight attendants walked past her. Nobody paid attention. Nobody except him. Ethan's heart rate picked up slightly. He had been in high-stakes situations before. Hostile takeovers, boardroom betrayals, negotiations worth billions. But this was different. Because if he was right, then somewhere in this plane, a little girl was in serious danger. Ethan Cole had built his empire by trusting his instincts. In boardrooms filled with sharks, in negotiations that could turn hostile in a second, his ability to see what others missed had saved him more times than he could count. And right now, that same instinct told him something was terribly wrong. The flight had settled into its rhythm. Passengers flipped through in-flight entertainment, the low hum of conversation filling the air. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. But Ethan wasn't paying attention to any of that. His focus was locked on the girl. She had stopped making the hand signal, but her body language was screaming. Her small shoulders were tense, rigid. She barely touched the juice in front of her. And then, there was the woman beside her. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every few minutes, she would glance around, not in a casual way, but as if checking for something, or someone. And the way she held the girl's wrist earlier, something wasn't right. Ethan shifted his gaze to the man in the aisle seat next to them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and too quiet. He hadn't said a single word since boarding. His hands gripped his bag tightly, his knuckles slightly pale. Ethan had seen that kind of posture before, a man trying too hard to blend in. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't a family. And that girl, she wasn't safe. He exhaled slowly. He needed to be smart. If he acted too soon, if he misread the situation, He could make things worse for the girl. But if he waited too long, she might not have time. Ethan glanced at the flight attendants. He had already noticed that they were overworked, distracted, and that meant only one thing. If he wanted to help this girl, he was on his own. Ethan kept his expression neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. He needed to be careful. If he confronted the situation directly, the people responsible might panic and do something reckless. No, he had to be smarter than that. His eyes flickered back to the flight attendants. The older one was still busy in the galley, handling a passenger complaint. The younger one, probably new, was rushing between rows, distributing drinks. And that was a problem, because Ethan knew the girl had already tried to ask for help, and she had been ignored. Ethan exhaled, adjusting his position. He raised a hand slightly, catching the younger flight attendant's attention as she passed. She stopped, offering a polite smile. "Yes, sir? Can I get you something?" Ethan glanced toward the girl's row, lowering his voice. "I think something might be wrong with that child," he said carefully. She was signaling for help earlier. The flight attendant frowned, following his gaze. The girl sat quietly, staring at her untouched juice. Beside her, the woman and the man looked completely normal, casual, calm, like any other passengers. Nothing seemed out of place. The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, are you sure? We have a lot of families traveling today." "I'm sure." Ethan's voice was firm. I recognized the hand signal she made. The flight attendant's polite expression faltered. But then she sighed. "Look, sir, I understand your concern, but we have protocols for situations like this. If there was something truly wrong, we'd..." She stopped mid-sentence. Because at that exact moment, the woman beside the girl turned and locked eyes with Ethan. And something in her gaze made the air feel heavier. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't curiosity. It was a warning. A silent message that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Ethan had seen that look before. The look of someone who knew they had been caught. The flight attendant followed his line of sight, shifting awkwardly. "Maybe she's just nervous about flying," she said, her tone less certain now. Ethan didn't take his eyes off the woman. "Or maybe she's terrified for another reason." The flight attendant bit her lip, hesitating. But then, a call button chimed from another row, and she visibly relaxed. "I'll keep an eye on it, sir," she said quickly before hurrying away. Ethan leaned back, jaw tightening. She wasn't going to do anything, which meant that if he wanted to help that girl, he had to find another way. Ethan's pulse remained steady, but his mind was already working 3 steps ahead. The flight attendant wasn't going to help, which meant he was on his own. He shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze locked on the girl. She was still sitting stiffly, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater. The woman beside her hadn't looked at her once. And the man on the aisle? He was holding his bag too tightly. Ethan had seen this before, in high-stakes business negotiations, in hostile deals where people pretended to be calm but were ready to act at any moment. They were waiting for something, and that meant he had to act first. A flight attendant passed by, heading toward the back of the plane. Ethan took the opportunity. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, stretching slightly as if just adjusting himself. Then, he took slow, measured steps down the aisle, toward the restroom. And as he passed the girl's row, he saw it. A tiny piece of folded paper, barely sticking out of the girl's sweater sleeve. Her hand clenched slightly, as if trying to keep it hidden. Ethan's heart pounded once. This was her message. He had one chance. Without stopping, he reached out with expert precision, grabbing the note in a single smooth motion. Then, he kept walking toward the restroom as if nothing had happened. Only when he was inside, with the door locked, did he finally unfold the paper. His stomach clenched. 2 words were scribbled in shaky, uneven handwriting. "Help me." Ethan exhaled, his grip tightening around the note. This wasn't just his instinct anymore. This was proof. And now, he had a decision to make. Because if he was right, then somewhere on this plane, a dangerous situation was about to unfold. Ethan stood in the cramped airplane restroom, the small note clenched in his hand. His heartbeat was steady, but his mind was moving fast. The girl was in trouble, and now, he was the only one who knew. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think logically. Calling attention to the situation too soon could spook the kidnappers. If they felt cornered, they might do something drastic. He needed to act, but he needed to be smart. Ethan carefully folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Then, he reached into his jacket, feeling the familiar weight of his phone. His fingers moved quickly, typing a message. Private number. Flight 247. Possible trafficking situation. Young girl, brown hair, window seat 14A. 2 adults with her. Requesting authorities upon landing. He hit send. The message went to a private security firm, a team he personally funded. They would make sure police were waiting at the gate. But there was still one problem. The plane wouldn't land for another 2 hours. And that was too much time for something to go wrong. Ethan stepped out of the restroom, moving carefully. As he made his way back to his seat, his eyes flickered toward the girl's row. She was staring straight ahead, her small hands clenched into fists. And then, the woman beside her whispered something into her ear. A soft, low murmur. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he saw the effect. The girl's body tensed. Her breathing quickened, and her eyes? They filled with fear. Ethan clenched his jaw. He didn't have 2 hours. He had to act now. He reached for the flight attendant call button, but then stopped. The crew hadn't believed him before. Would they believe him now? His mind raced through options. Then, suddenly, a voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing mild turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Ethan barely heard the words, because at that exact moment, the man in the aisle seat stood up and grabbed his bag. Ethan's pulse spiked. Something was happening. This wasn't normal. The man wasn't following the seatbelt sign. He was moving toward the back of the plane, toward the exit row, toward something Ethan couldn't see yet. And for the first time since stepping onto this flight, Ethan realized this might be bigger than just a kidnapping. Ethan's mind sharpened like a blade. The man who had been sitting beside the girl was now moving toward the back of the plane, ignoring the seatbelt sign, ignoring the flight attendants, and clutching his bag a little too tightly. Ethan had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize one thing instantly. This wasn't panic. This was a plan. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had 2 possibilities. Keycap 1, the man was simply leaving to use the restroom. Keycap 2, something much worse was about to happen. And with every step the man took, Ethan's gut told him it was the second. Ethan shifted slightly, discreetly unbuckling his seatbelt. The woman sitting next to the girl hadn't moved. She was watching. Her expression was blank, but there was something unnatural about it, as if she was waiting for a signal. Ethan knew that look. He had seen it in corporate spies, in hostile takeovers, in people who were waiting for their moment to strike. She wasn't nervous. She was patient, and that meant Ethan was out of time. His first instinct was to alert the crew, but would they believe him? He had already tried once. If he caused panic too soon, the situation could explode into chaos. He needed proof. Or, he needed to force their hand. Ethan exhaled slowly, then stood, casually, like he was just stretching, like he wasn't about to disrupt something far bigger than a kidnapping. The moment he stepped into the aisle, the woman beside the girl turned her head sharply. Their eyes locked. For the first time, Ethan saw something in her expression. Not anger, not concern, recognition. Ethan kept his face unreadable, but inside, his thoughts were racing. She knew him. She knew who he was. And that meant one terrifying thing. This wasn't random. He had just stepped into something much, much bigger than he realized. And now, the real game was about to begin. Ethan's muscles tensed. The woman beside the girl knew him. That changed everything. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was planned. And now, he was at the center of it. The man who had moved toward the back of the plane was still gripping his bag. Too tightly. Ethan had seen that posture before, in security briefings, in risk analysis reports. The way his knuckles turned pale. The way his stance shifted, ready for action. Ethan's heart pounded once. This wasn't just about the girl anymore. This flight was in danger. The woman beside the girl suddenly leaned forward and whispered something. The girl's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing quickened. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the aisle, walking slowly, but deliberately, toward the back of the plane. If the man was about to act, Ethan needed to be closer. Passengers barely noticed him moving. Most were lost in their movies or asleep against the windows. But Ethan wasn't focused on them. He was focused on the man with the bag. The man took another step toward the exit row. And then, he reached inside his jacket. Ethan reacted instantly. He didn't wait to see what the man was reaching for. He lunged, grabbing the man's wrist just as his fingers closed around something metallic. A struggle erupted in the narrow aisle. Passengers gasped, a few shrieking in surprise. The flight attendants turned, eyes wide. And in that split second, the woman beside the girl stood up. Her hand dipped into her purse. And Ethan knew. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Time slowed. Ethan had trained his mind to see patterns, to predict moves before they happened. And right now, everything was happening at once. The man in the aisle struggled against Ethan's grip, his free hand still reaching for whatever was in his jacket. Passengers screamed. Someone fumbled with a call button, frantically trying to alert the crew. The flight attendants froze in shock. And then, the woman beside the girl moved. Fast. Her hand dove into her purse. Ethan saw the glint of something metallic. Instinct took over. Ethan tightened his grip on the man's wrist, then twisted sharply. A muffled grunt of pain. Something clattered to the floor. A small black device. Not a gun. Not a knife. Something worse. His mind processed it in an instant. A trigger. A detonator. And that meant this wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a hijacking. The woman beside the girl yanked something from her purse. And Ethan moved before she could act. With one sharp motion, he shoved the man backward, sending him crashing into the seats. The woman turned, a syringe in her hand. Passengers gasped. Someone yelled, "She has a weapon!" And suddenly, everything exploded into motion. A flight attendant tackled the woman, grabbing for the syringe. Ethan turned back to the man. But the fight wasn't over. The man lunged at Ethan, this time with pure desperation. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to complete whatever mission he had started. Ethan ducked just in time. The man's fist whizzed past his ear. Ethan countered, a sharp elbow to the ribs. The man gasped, then stumbled, hitting his head against the seat. And finally, he collapsed. Silence. For a moment, the plane was frozen. Then, a voice over the intercom. "This is the captain. Security has been alerted. We will be making an emergency landing." Passengers burst into murmurs, some crying, some whispering in disbelief. Ethan exhaled slowly, heart still pounding. He turned and locked eyes with the girl. Her hands were still shaking, but for the first time since the flight began, there was relief in her eyes. She was safe. For now, the plane was descending. Outside, the airport runway was rushing closer. Inside, the tension was still thick, even though the immediate danger was over. The man Ethan had taken down was still unconscious, restrained with zip ties by a flight attendant. The woman, breathing heavily, sat handcuffed in an empty row. And the girl? She hadn't let go of her armrests since the moment Ethan stopped the attack. Her face was pale, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. A crackling voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Authorities are waiting at the gate." Outside, through the small airplane windows, Ethan could already see them. Police, FBI, tactical teams, waiting. And then, with a jolt, the plane touched down. A wave of relief and exhaustion rippled through the passengers. But for Ethan, it wasn't over yet. The moment the doors opened, everything moved fast. Armed officers stormed the cabin, securing the suspects within seconds. Passengers gasped as the unconscious man was carried off the plane. The woman? She didn't say a word. She just stared at Ethan, like she was memorizing his face. And then, she was gone, escorted away in cuffs. Ethan finally exhaled. Then he turned. The young flight attendant, the same one who had ignored his warning earlier, stood frozen, her face pale with shock. She stammered. "I didn't realize." Ethan gave her a calm, knowing look. "Next time," he said quietly, "pay attention." Her throat bobbed. She nodded. Lesson learned. Finally, Ethan looked toward the little girl. She was still in her seat, still gripping the armrests, still afraid. Ethan walked forward, slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle her. And then, for the first time, he spoke to her directly. "You're safe now." Her eyes flickered up to meet his. And then, a whisper. "Who are you?" Ethan hesitated. Then, with a small smile, he said the words very few people ever got to hear. "Just someone who pays attention." And with that, he turned and walked away. Ethan stepped off the plane. The night air was cool against his skin as he walked down the jet bridge, past a swarm of uniformed officers, flashing lights, and anxious airline staff. But he barely noticed any of it. His mind was still back in that cabin, still with the little girl, still hearing her whispered words. "Who are you?" Inside the airport terminal, chaos continued. Reporters had already caught wind of the incident, rushing toward the arrival gates with cameras. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, some in shock, some in awe. And at the center of it all, the girl stood with a social worker, wrapped in a blanket too big for her small frame. She was safe now, but Ethan knew her life would never be the same. A man in a black suit approached him, one of his private security operatives. "Everything is handled, sir," he said in a low voice. "The authorities have full control." Ethan nodded, but his gaze didn't leave the girl. He had power, influence, resources. But this wasn't about money. This was about something deeper, something priceless. He took a step forward, but then stopped, because the girl had already turned to him. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, with small, trembling fingers, she made a silent gesture. The same signal she had used on the plane. The signal for help. Only this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a thank you. Ethan felt something stir in his chest. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt like all the wealth in the world meant nothing compared to this moment. With a small nod, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Because the truth was, he didn't need recognition. He didn't need a reward. He just needed to know he had done the right thing. And sometimes, paying attention was the most powerful thing a person could do.